Maybe the sponsor is in a snit, but since I lifted our hair restrictions, we've gone undefeated. Hey everyone, this is Will O'Toole welcoming you to another edition of Park Ridge Sports History. In this episode, with baseball almost upon us, we only have a few weeks, hours, minutes, and seconds until the baseball season 2025 begins. I want to look back almost 60 years at the 1965 New York Yankee baseball team as they sunk into the throes of the dark pit of losing for another 11, 12 years. And why it's such a significant point is because in 1964, the Yankees were coming off another pennant. Yes, they did lose a dramatic 7-game World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals, who were really a mini dynasty, winning 3 pennants in the 1960s and 2 World Series. So they were nothing to be ashamed about losing to. But nevertheless, what makes this whole season significant is that the Yankees got rid of their pennant-winning Yogi Berra, a huge mistake, and then hired Johnny Keane, who had just beaten them in the 7-game Classic, as their new manager from the St. Louis Cardinals, and that turned into a disaster. So, without further ado, let's move on. I talked about in this cartoon the hair restrictions being lifted or being cut out of Yankee rules and protocols, but more significantly is the 1964/65. Those 12, let's just say even 14 months in Yankee history, because I was trying to do a study about this, and I was looking back at some old predictions for the 1965 season. Nobody was ruling the Yankees out. And to be fair to the Yankees, they finished 77-85. All right. One of their worst records during their dynasty, from all the way back from the 20s up until 1960, 64, 65. But it's true. It's one of their worst seasons ever in all those years. But what makes it significant is that so many people thought that the Yankees were going to challenge. And I want to take a look at the roster because I think it's going into a season, you never know what's going to happen. Injuries, age, personalities, they all play a part in a team's success or failures. And I think in particular, there were 2 things that really played a part in that Yankee season of 65. And that was injuries and personalities. And I'm just going to go over some of the rosters. I was looking at an article, and I didn't realize this. Well, I did, but this kind of reinforced my thought. The Yankees were predicted to be a good team. In fact, just taking a look at the roster on that 1965 Yankee team, you still had many of the same stars coming back. And I'm talking about Whitey Ford and Roger Maris, and of course the great Mickey Mantle. Also, you had 1963's MVP, Elson Howard, coming back to play at catcher. But what you didn't have on that team was a guy by the name of Yogi Berra, who managed brilliantly the ball club in 1965, getting them to within 1 game of winning the whole thing. And he does actually a similar thing with the Mets in 73. So I'm just going to take a look at some of the things that transpired for the Yankees in 1965. And that was this. They basically had, in 64, they were 99-63. They were tied for first in runs and tied for first in runs allowed, or fewest runs allowed, at 3.5. So they were basically winning each game, those almost 100 games, by a solid 1 run. They were 50-31 at home, 49-32 away. So they were built for not just Yankee Stadium, but for playing in the visitors. 11-15 in extra innings, 27-24 in 1-run games, 57-38 against right-handed pitching, and then 42-25 against left-handed pitching. They were decent. Well, actually, they were really fantastic. They were 10 games over 500 against teams that played 500 or better, and they were 58-32. So they did beat up on the crummy teams, but that's what you're supposed to do. They were 58-32. They only won that game by one over the Chicago White Sox that year. That was one of the great runs by the White Sox. Nevertheless, I was trying to figure this out. All right, so the Yankees lose in 64, and I was trying to think of the records or performances just from that point. And I'm just going to use, let's say, the 20 years from that point. In 64, the Yankees lose the World Series. They don't return. And that's where I was thinking, how many teams won the pennant and didn't return the next year or even several years after that? Because remember, the Yankees don't get back to the World Series until 1976, a full 12 years after 64. 65, you have the Twins. They don't get back until 1987. So they were really, although they do win 2 Western Division titles in 69 and 70, getting swept both the years by the Orioles. In 67, because this is what I was doing, what happened in the next 10 years? 67, you have the Miracle Red Sox, the Impossible Dream Team. They don't get back until 75, although in 72 they lose by a half game to the Detroit Tigers. And the only reason for that discrepancy, half game, they don't make up any of the games that were a result of the strike that happened early in the season. So the Red Sox and Major League Baseball, most teams lost about 8 or 9 games, and the Red Sox took it on the chin on that one. Then you have in 68, you have the Tigers. They don't return until 84, although they do win with that group of guys or the remaining group of guys in 72 and lose a 5-game series to the Oakland A's. Then you have in 1969, you have the Orioles and their machine. Well, the Orioles lose. They are the first team to actually return the following year, 70, beat the Reds, and then return again in 71. But many of those teams, after 71, they do win in 73 and 74, but they get beat by the great Oakland teams, and they really didn't return until 79. Then you have in 1972, 73, and 74, the great Oakland A's teams who hadn't seen a championship from way back, 1930 Philadelphia A's. So they go through that whole stretch in Kansas City not winning or not even sniffing a pennant. And then, of course, to round it out, you have a return of the Red Sox in 75. So I was looking and I'm saying, wow, the Yankees losing, and with the exception of probably Minnesota losing like that. Oh, and here's the deal. At least the A's would return again in 75. That would be their last hurrah as the great Oakland A's team, but they would lose in 75 to the Red Sox and wouldn't get back into the World Series until 1989. So you're talking about maybe, I shouldn't say unique, but the Yankees have, when you think about it, really went the longest with the exception of maybe but I shouldn't say that because I'm talking about at least winning division titles. So the Yankees in 65, it is significant because they don't get back until 1976. And for their franchise, and even any baseball franchise, it's really a long time. And I was just using the American League and those teams. And the reason why I use those teams is that in 64, the Yankees went 49 and 41 against those teams I mentioned that would go on to the World Series. Baltimore, they're 8-10. Boston, 9-9. Detroit, 10-8. KC, they were 12-6. And Minnesota, 10-8. So they were pretty decent, 49-41, against teams that were either developing into a pennant winner or needed a couple more years, the Kansas City A's. Because you got to remember this, those Kansas City A's teams, even though they were terrible in Kansas City, Finley moves them to Oakland. and much like the Washington Senators, who watched their team leave and go to Minnesota to become the Twins, much like that, the Kansas City fans who did support them, or the ones who did support them, lost out on the great A's teams of 72, 73, and 74. But that team was developed in KC with Hunter and Reggie Jackson and soon to be Rick Monday and Sal Bando and Campy Campaneris, etc. So they had, my whole point was they had a core group that they were going to and did build around. So here's what happens. The Yankees lose in 1964, lose a heartbreaker to Bob Gibson and the St. Louis Cardinals. No shame in that. As I've mentioned time and time again, Gibson would probably be the guy I would want to put on the mound if I had to win a Game 7. Without a doubt. 7-2 lifetime in the World Series. Phenomenal pitcher. What makes me mad is he only won 252. I know that sounds, it's still amazing, but you just think of Gibson winning 300 alongside Tom Seaver. Anyway, the Yankees in 64, the league average was 155 homers. They hit 7 more. The league average for triples, they hit 2 more in the league average of 33. The league average for doubles, they were under by 3. And I think significantly that may play a role. And then in stolen bases or singles, they were a plus 55. But then I was looking at stolen bases. Here's the deal. The Yankees in 64 stole 54 of 72 bases for a 66.6 or 66.7 percentage or a 67 percentage. The league average was 54-84, slightly below at 64.3. Why I think that's significant is this. I'm not saying that speed kills and that teams that have more stolen bases are necessarily going to be champions and stuff, but I think when you compare the 54 stolen bases that they get in 64 to the 35 that they steal in 65, I think it's significant. Why? Because new manager Johnny Keane was really kind of like a Whitey Ball, the Whitey Herzog type of thing. And so he did a lot of hit and run, moved the players along. Meanwhile, that 64 team was built along the lines of the Earl Weaver teams of get on base and wait for the 3-run home run. I think it's significant, though, that Yankee team stole 54 bases, had a 67% stolen base percentage of success. Meanwhile, the 1965 team was at 63%, stealing only 35 bases. And in fact, they were below league average in hits, below league average in doubles, below league average in triples, but a little bit higher than league average in home runs. The Yankees actually finished 5th in the league with 149 home runs in 65. So I think there is a little play of the Yankees just got slow and the Yankees got old at positions or in players that they never expected to get slow and old. All right. That Yankee team was composed of what would soon to be his last year in the major leagues, Tony Kubek, playing shortstop. And he was forced into retirement because he had a bad back and doctors feared or told him that he could have permanent damage if he continued to play. So Kubek leaves the game hitting only .218. The year before, of course, Kubek didn't make the All-Star team, but he did have some Hall of Fame years with the Yankees. And of course, 1960, they always trace that pebble hitting Kubek in the throat as really a turning point in that Game 7. And it was, because it led to Hal Smith home run and then eventually the Bill Mazeroski home run in the bottom of the 9th inning to seal the deal for the Pirates. Anyway, so you can see he got hurt in his last throws, and the Yankees don't move in a young player of significance. Johnny Keane, I guess, thought that these were the horses. He was going to ride them until they dropped. The problem is they did drop. And to a certain extent, the Yankees didn't play bad ball. They were just mediocre. And let me preface it. What I mean by it sounds like a yo-yo. They didn't play bad ball. They were just mediocre. It wasn't like they just bottomed out and won only 40 games. But they were never in the pennant race. In fact, they were always mired like 6 games under, 4 games under. They could never stop treading water on the season. Another guy who hurt them that year and didn't really fulfill expectations or what the Yankees envisioned was, of course, Jim Bouton. And of course, you've heard me talk about Bouton, the great book Ball 4. But Bouton had won 20 games, had won 18, had pitched brilliantly in the World Series in 63. And then his arm just, bad arm, sore arm. And that turns into a 4-15 record. Let's just say this, and I know there are some people that don't like hypotheticals, but you start to say this. If Bouton's season was even just 500, let's just say he goes 10-9 or even 9-10. Now you're talking about a team that's 82-80. And of course, the Yankees were also counting on Whitey Ford. And Ford was okay, went 16-13, all right? Not the normal Whitey Ford season that they were used to. You got to remember, in 61, his greatest season probably in baseball history, he had won 25 games. So he was down, also 4 or 5 years older, which is, when you talk about a half decade in the major leagues, that's a long time. And things completely change. Bill James came up with the theory and kind of shown it through data that age 27 seems to be the premier or the ultimate or usually the best season a player is going to have, and then he's going to slowly decline if he's a great player, but he still is going to decline. And for Whitey Ford, he was 35 years old in 64. Now he's 36. And Ford goes in 65. He's 16-13, decent ERA, yet it's a point, more than the point above what he had the year before. Interestingly enough, in 66, when the Yankees really bottomed out, he goes 2-5. His ERA is a nice 2.47, but he only threw 73 innings. So he was done. In 63, he had 124. In 61, his best season, 125 in terms of winning games, 3.21 ERA. But you can see where I'm coming. 25 at age 32. And then 17, age 33, the Yankees win. 24, his last outrageous season for the Yankees. He's 24-7. Yankees get swept in the World Series, but he's age 34. And then by 64, he does make the All-Star team, but he goes 17-6 in 64. But by 65, 16-13. So you are talking about a 4-game swing in the Yankee record, with Ford only going 16-13. All these little things mean that the Yankees' 99 wins are slowly. So there's 4 wins, and let's just say it's 5 wins for Jim Bouton that they were maybe counting on. So that's 9 wins. Now you're down to 90. You're 90-72. Right. I was looking at the WAR between 64 and 65. The difference in WAR in 64, the Yankees were a plus 19.9. In 65, they were a negative 1.4. And let's take a look at that 64 team. All right. Interestingly enough, all right, here's what the Yankees had in 64. The 64 Yankees, I'm just trying to get it here with one of my great references. I'm actually using 2 great references today, Baseball Almanac and Baseball Reference, and an article I found on a website called thisgreatgame.com. Interesting. So you have in 64, the leader in WAR, Whitey Ford, 6.8, Elston Howard, a year after his MVP, 5.5, and Mickey Mantle, 4.8. That Yankee team, Elston Howard, 15-84, 313. Try to remember these stats because I'm going to give you 1965s as well. Here's something I don't understand. Joe Pepitone, a minus 0.7 in WAR with a 28 100 RBI, one of only two men on the Yankees in 64 to drive in 100 runs. Hit 251, didn't draw a lot of walks. I get all that. Bobby Richardson was 450 and 267. Kubek, 229, 8 and 31 as he played 106 games. Phil Linz filled in at shortstop for the most part. Clete Boyer probably had, in 64, a terrible season for him offensively, 8 and 52, 218. He was like a 255 hitter, Boyer, 15 homers, around 60, maybe 70 RBIs. That's what you would envision with him. He was really, some people think he was comparable to Brooks Robinson, and that had Brooks not been in the league, or if Clete had been in the National League, he would have won quite a few Gold Gloves, just like the Hoover vacuum cleaner, the human vacuum cleaner in Brooks Robinson. Tom Tresh, all right, one-time Rookie of the Year, 1673, 246. Mantle hit 303 with 35 and 111. And, of course, Roger Maris, 2671, 281. And he was age 29, so he's on that downside of age 27. In 65, here's the problem with these Yankee teams. In 65, those same guys I'm talking about, Elston Howard, now age 36, and you see, maybe this is where the Yankees didn't realize, age 36, you're asking this guy to put up the same numbers as he did 3 or 4 years before, playing catcher, the most difficult spot in all of baseball. And Elston produced 945, 233. Pepitone, actually on the positive side of WAR with a 1.1, 1862 and 247, increased his walks by 43. But that's a full almost 2 points, a positive. But Richardson, now at negative, 647, 247, playing 160 games. Kubek, like I said, in his last years, managed 109 games. Phil Linz coming in for 99 games, but really not doing much with the offense or with his bat, hitting only 16 RBIs and hitting 207. Boyer got back up to 1858 and 231, actually had a 2.9 WAR. And, of course, I'm only pointing out the WAR just to give you an idea of, let's say, a measurement of success or an increase or decrease. Mantle, huge, only played 122 games as injuries. 1946, 255. Probably 64 was his last great season. Never hit 30 home runs again. And Tom Tresh, 2674, hit 279. Probably Tresh's last great year as a Yankee. Had a 3.8 WAR. And Hector Lopez, who comes in, and this is probably one of the big things. He's 35 years old, comes up with a poor season, a negative 0.5 WAR. 739, 261 are his stats. He replaces, for the most part, Roger Maris. And in Roger Maris, this is the difference. It took Hector Lopez more than double the number of games to hit not even as many home runs and only drive in 12 more runs than Maris. So you see, that was a huge loss for the Yankees. Maris, 827, 239. He was, reports about him was that he was injured, hurt his hand. It was misdiagnosed. Doctor misdiagnosed it, the hand. It was actually broken, and Maris would suffer in his last couple of years with the Yankees trying to get healthy again, and would never return to, obviously, his brilliance of 60, 61, 62 with those great Yankee teams. All those things fashioned together. Now, here's the point, and probably this is where I say personalities get into it. Keane was from a different cloth from Yogi Berra. Now, you got to remember this. Yogi Berra, a Yankee legend, a Yankee institution, unfairly fired after the 64 season. There's no question about it. How do I know? Take a look at what he did with that Met team in 1973. with a team that could not hit, with a team with only 2 or 3 guys on the pitching staff over 500. You had Tom Seaver, maybe a wounded Rusty Staub who comes back and gets hot. He's got a Cleon Jones who gets hot in the later stages. That's it. And he's got, yes, the brilliance of Tug McGraw coming out of the bullpen. He does have 2 good lefties, as I've stressed, Jerry Kuzman and John Matlack. But if you take a look, they're both they were both a game under 500. Make a long story short, Yogi wins, and he nearly pulled off another miracle in Queens at Shea Stadium by beating that Oakland A's team. And in fact, you could actually argue it might have been a greater miracle than beating the Orioles, because the A's would win 3 straight World Series. Meanwhile, Baltimore would only win the one over the Reds. So they replaced Berra, probably seen as a player's manager. And they bring in the high-strung Johnny Keane, fresh off a win, maybe feeling his oats a little bit, maybe having a little bit of, hey, I beat you guys, and now I've been asked to join you routine. And from the beginning, he did have some personality problems with the entrenched Yankee veterans. And, of course, injuries mounted. And, of course, if you read any of the excerpts from Ball 4, you know that Johnny Keane would come up to Mickey Mantle. This is told by Jim Bowden, and say, hey, can you play today? Now, I don't want you to play if you're hurt, but if you can play, that would help us. And by the time the whole thing is, Mantle, instead of being rested and maybe used a little bit more strategically, now you got to remember, they were only 8 games under 500. You know, it's interesting. Just some little tidbits I discovered. And what I would like to do in a future show, when I have a little bit more time, is talk about how teams that don't win, what their success rate is of getting back into the World Series. Do they improve or do they fall? And is it necessarily a great fall like the Yankees did for those 12 years? But that team, the Yankees in 65, you know what's interesting? They were 40-43 at home and 37-42 on the road. Now, that's not a miscalculation by me. Yes, the Yankees actually played 83 games at home where they were under 500, 3 games, and then 37-42, only 79 games on the road. And I looked, the team that surrendered, let's say, 3 home games that year was the Baltimore Orioles. They actually played 3 more games on the road. And I do believe, and I you know what, I will check for my next show, because it was just something in passing. It kind of dawned on me as I was going to taping this show. And it's interesting. Now, whether there was, let's say, what happened with Montreal this is many years later, up at the Olympic Dome, where pieces of the concrete were falling because it was such it was just in ruins, that place, where they had to move certain games to Puerto Rico to finish out the season, or they actually played, I think, let's say, their last 20 games on the road instead of being able to play in Montreal. I'm curious about that. But even with the extra 3 games, the Yankees were unable to get out of mediocrity on this team. And as I said, I lay the blame more and more as I read this. And listen, injuries, age, performance, just players' motivation all come into play. Sometimes it's very difficult to get back up and play in championship form after you had such a devastating loss. Yes, this is the pedigree Yankees. I know this. Mantle actually cried after the 60 World Series, so upset that the Yankees lost that series to the Pirates. We had mentioned that earlier in the broadcast. And perhaps in 64, the Yankees, again, aging, getting older, longer in the tooth, maybe they just didn't have the same motivation. And, of course, the injuries playing a part. But the other thing, as I said, Johnny Keane probably, and I don't want to lay the burden on all, but here's the thing. As I said, they got rid of Yogi. who would later go on and do the same thing for the Mets, leading them miraculously to the, out of last place to win the 1973 pennant with a far inferior team. And yet with this Yankee team in 64, it would have been interesting to see what Yogi could have done with this team despite all of the injuries. He probably would have taken a chance asking maybe management to bring up Bobby Mercer sooner, maybe giving more games or more innings to the younger players like a Horace Clarke, maybe inserting Roy White. Remember on that team, they did have a big bonus baby in Roger Repose, who never really lived up to his press clippings with the Yankees, would go on and play, I think, a couple of years for the Angels, then with the White Sox, never really fulfilled his tremendous potential. And of course, that's scouting. And I think that has a lot to do, not just with talent, but also, again, with motivation and desire of the player. And can they actually play in New York? That 65 team, here's the interesting thing. They actually had 5 All-Stars from the Yankees who would go on and play in Bloomington, home field of the Minnesota Twins. They had the same amount as they did in 1964. And as I mentioned earlier, those 5 were Whitey Ford, Elson Howard, and this is 64, Mickey Mantle, Joe Pepitone, and Bobby Richardson. But in 65, Elson Howard was selected but didn't play because of injury. Mickey Mantle, injured, did not play. 65, Pepitone having a better year, even though his numbers were down in terms of power. And Bobby Richardson, age 29, really probably was selected more for his defense and because of his Yankee pedigree than anything else. And a young Mel Stottlemyre. And Stottlemyre, it's a shame. Stottlemyre we could do, and I might just do a whole episode on Mel Stottlemyre and maybe Bobby Mercer and guys who played for the Yankees during those lean years who probably would have been unbelievable, maybe even cusp Hall of Famers had they either been born sooner or born a little later to be part of those 77, 76, 77, 78 Yankees, or to be part of those unbelievable early 60s teams of 60, 61, 62, and 63. Mercer was a good player, solid player. He came up as a shortstop, as I indicated earlier, and they moved him to center field as they had Gene Michael. And probably Mercer was better for center field. But he's a guy, and this is what I'm saying. If Yogi maybe had been there instead of Johnny Keane, probably having to deal with maybe what he felt undue pressure, maybe more put on him than by management, let's say, maybe he would have given shots to a guy like Mercer and more to Roy White. And maybe he would have rested a Jim Bouton, who was suffering with the 4-15 record and obviously a sore arm. Maybe he wouldn't have pushed Mickey Mantle. Maybe they would have had a better. These are all maybe hypotheticals. I understand it. But these are the if questions that you ask and could have changed the course of history. Or maybe the Yankees were just so old that really what they needed was a major overhaul. Maybe you can even argue this. Maybe if they pushed Maris out, maybe if they traded Maris over the winter and said, do the Branch Rickey, get rid of him a year too soon rather than a year too late. Maybe doing the same with Mantle, asking Mantle, you know what, you're done. We're going to put you part-time or we're going to move you to first base. Maybe trade Pepitone, which they later did. Those are some of the things that the Yankees maybe could have done with a different manager. As I said, I'm not laying all the blame on Johnny Keane, but you got to remember, you're the new guy in, you're replacing an icon. You beat this team last year. You certainly want to come in, maybe a little resentment there, a little jealousy that they beat you. Now we hired the guy to beat you, but nevertheless. And the shame of it all is Keane does finish out that first year, starts out in 66, goes 4-16, I believe, and is fired. And I think all of the pressure that he felt with the Yankees, all the pressure maybe he put on himself, led to perhaps an early heart attack or an early heart attack and an early death. He died at age 53 or 54 after being released or fired by the Yankees. And who knows? Probably the unbelievable pressure of being a Yankee manager was just too great for him. And that happens sometimes. Sometimes players and managers, coaches, are better suited for different environments than what was the Yankee Dynasty on really Crumbling, the Crumbling Yankee Dynasty of 1965. Hope it sorts it out. I know this. Yankees of 1965 will never be remembered near and dear to the hearts of Yankee fans. They will be remembered as the beginning of the end, at least the dark ages for Yankees, the Enlightenment period for other baseball fans, as we reviewed here on Park History, the 1965 Yankee Ball Club. This is Will O'Toole. Thank you for joining us. See you next week with another episode. Bye now.